Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Excited about the start of the 2014 World Chess Championships, and knowing that we're not going to have another championship for 2 more years, the stakes have never been higher. 2 competitors, the reigning champion Magnus Carlsen, the young gun, the Norwegian, his opponent Vishy Anand from India. He played last year as the champion. This year, because he won the candidates tournament earlier in the year, he is the challenger, but he wants the crown back. So definitely excited. For those curious, this goes from November 8th through November 25th. There's a day before and day after that as far as the opening ceremony and the closing ceremony. But each player, they'll have 2 games, so they play 1 game a day, and then they have a rest day, and then they play 2 more games, and then there's a rest day, and they also alternate colors. In this first game we're going to be over today, Vishy Anand is going to be playing the white pieces, and Magnus Carlsen is going to be playing the black pieces. So hopefully you guys are excited as I am. We'll go ahead and get started with game number 1. Going into the first match, I was definitely interested to see how both sides would come out of the gates. Last year, if you remember, the first 4 games that they played were all draws, and we were just kind of waiting for something exciting to happen. So hoping that kind of Vishy Anand gets us off to a great start with the white pieces, and then obviously Magnus Carlsen, the best player in the world right now, playing the black pieces. Excited to see how he defends. So Vishy starts out with pawn to d4, one of the most common openings from grandmasters nowadays. And then we see knight f6, pawn to c4, and pawn to g6. So playing the Grunfeld defense, something that we don't normally see Magnus Carlsen play. So maybe he's been studying some different lines that maybe he wants to try out against Vishy Anand. Maybe there's some tournaments lately he's seen from Vishy that he thinks this is a good defense, but definitely something that we're not super familiar with from Magnus Carlsen playing on a regular basis. Knight to c3, pawn to d5. So if you're not super familiar with the Grunfeld defense, there's a few variations that you can play. The most common line that you'll see is the exchange variation, and that is the exchange variation that we see in this particular game. Pawn taking here on d5. We do the exchange off the board right here. Bishop to d2, and this is kind of a subtle change in how white approaches the Grunfeld defense. Black does have a few options as well. He could, after the bishop comes here to g7, fianchettoing, getting ready to castle on the king side, he can take here on c6. He can later push forward with a pawn to c5. He could play knight to c6. So he has a lot of different options. He doesn't, again, have to take this. He can always kick back here to b6 and then try to push forward a little bit if he wants to. So he does have some options. After pawn here to e4, Magnus Carlsen decides to go ahead and play the exchange here on c3. And the reason this bishop came here to d2 is the subtlety of bishop taking here on c3 and not having to worry about this pawn here on c3. Now again, the Grunfeld defense is a hyper-modern defense, so black is not trying to control the center of the board right here. Instead, he's trying to develop his minor pieces towards each side. So this bishop is fianchettoed. It's controlling the center from the side of the board. The knight could come here to c6. You could always play pawn to b6 if you wanted to, fianchetto his bishop here. But later, going to be looking forward to push forward with his pawns. He could push forward with pawn to e5 and try to break up the center of the board. Again, pawn to c5 is definitely something that we see a lot of times in the Grunfeld defense. So you know, black definitely is not trying to do anything right now, but later on, Magnus Carlsen has a lot of different ways that he can counterplay. Magnus Carlsen now castles on the king side, and then queen to d2. And again, anytime you're going to be developing your minor pieces, typically that's going to be where you castle. So white's going to be looking to castle on the queen side, then possibly control this semi-open c file right here. Magnus Carlsen then played a knight to c6, and he had a few options. Now, again, because it is a hypermodern defense, he's trying to control the center of the board. So, knight to c6 starts to add a lot of pressure on this pawn here on d4. He has both his queen, his knight, and his bishop right here. But a lot of times you'll see the bishop come outside here, and then maybe pawn to e6 once the bishop's outside. Then let's say knight to d7, and then pawn to c5, now protected by that knight right there. So knight to c6, although it is fairly straightforward. It's not always the most common move in the Grunfeld defense. But from here, we see knight to f3. And again, Vishy Anand could have decided to go ahead and play pawn to d5, trying to alleviate some of that pressure on his pawn on d4. But you know, knight to e5, that's going to be fine right here for black. So instead, just decided to play the more common move, knight to f3, bishop to g4, trying to get the light square bishop out involved into the game. Sometimes, depending on what the pawn structure might look like, with, you know, pawn here to e6, this light square bishop just kind of hangs out, doesn't do too much. So definitely get involved is going to be good for Magnus Carlsen. Now the pawn pushes forward with pawn to d5, and then we see an exchange here. So it's pretty interesting how both sides want to play this. Magnus Carlsen could decide just to go ahead and play his knight somewhere else, but decides, you know what, I'm not too worried about it right now. I'm going to go ahead and exchange off this light square bishop that I don't want to be using on board. Vishy Anand decides, okay, I want to get a little aggressive as well. I'm going to go ahead and exchange both these dark square bishops off the board. So after the king takes, we're now going to see the pawn take here on f3, and then after the knight comes here to e5, we see a Vishy Anand castle on the queen side. So again, very interesting to see how both sides wanted to exchange in that particular case. You know, with just right here, this knight is attacking the pawn on f3. You know, Vishy wanted to castle anyway, but it would have been extremely bad if he just lets Magnus Carlsen take right there. After here, it's going to be a huge mistake if Magnus Carlsen takes, just if you haven't seen it. Queen to c3 check, and also attacking this knight. It's going to be very, very bad for Magnus Carlsen, so he can't do that. Instead, he needs to come up with another solution, and so he decides to go ahead and start chipping away at the center of the board. He recognizes he's pretty much completed his development. He does need to get his queen involved, but he needs to start breaking up the center of the board so he can have some sort of counterplay. So let's look at what both sides are trying to do here. From Black's perspective, he's looking to exchange here, take here on d5, bring his rook over here to c8, really control this long foul right here. White definitely needs to have some sort of safety with his king, so if he wants to bring his king over here to b1, that's going to be okay. You know, White has a few options. He could play pawn here to f4, kind of force this knight to move back here. Could always play bishop to h3, not allowing his opponent to bring his rook over here to c8 anytime. So White could also, if he wanted to, start to try to attack on the king side. So pushing forward with pawn to h4 at some point, getting the light square bishop maybe over here, starting to add more pressure on the king side, bring his rook over here to g1, and really start to attack his opponent. This is also very opportunistic for Anand. It really depends on how aggressive both of these players want to be. Typically, if you have both sides castling on either side of the board, there's going to be fireworks. But again, first game, you have a 12-game series in this whole match. It's going to be interesting to see how aggressive or how passive both of these players want to play. So first, we're going to have queen here to c3, and this kind of forces Magnus Carlsen's hand. He can't move this knight. It's pinned down to the king right here, so he really only has this pawn to f6. Now, this does mean Magnus Carlsen even more so wants to play his rook over here to c8, because then if he can ever just play, you know, pawn to d5, all of a sudden this queen is kind of in a tough spot because it's being pinned down to the king right here. So Vishy Anand decides he wants to go ahead and play bishop here to h3, stopping the potential threat of rook over here to c8. He, again, I think it would have been fun if he played the pawn here to f4, kind of forcing this knight to move back here to, let's say, f7, and then after the pawn takes right here, you could see queen to c7. You know, the pawn can't really take here on b7, would be giving up material on board. You could have the queen come down here to f4 check. If the queen, or if this king comes over here to b1, then, you know, check, and then this pawn's going to fall. If for some reason the queen comes here to e3, then you could have queen to c7 check, and then you could just gobble up this material here on b7. So it would have been interesting to see how that would have gone. f4 would have been a pretty fun and aggressive move. But bishop to h3, again, talking about the threats that Magnus Carlsen has, makes a lot of sense for Vishy Anand. So we're going to see this pawn take here on d5. The pawn recaptures here on d5. Always important to know the different pawns that may have some weaknesses on board. This pawn right here on d5 is an isolated pawn, so it doesn't have any protection from the other pawns. Black definitely can put a lot of pressure on this pawn. Now, he doesn't have a lot of bishops or some of his other minor pieces beyond this knight, so it could be tough to put too much pressure, but he can start to build up a lot on this semi-open d-file. Black, on the other hand, has the backward pawn here on e7, so that's something to keep in mind. If Anand wants to go ahead and put a lot of pressure on this semi-open e-file, he can start to do that. And then Vishy Anand also has the double pawn here on the f-file. Definitely not something you want to have going into the endgame, something that Magnus Carlsen may use to his advantage. So we now see the knight come back here to f7, opening up the possibility if he wants to play knight to d6, kind of stopping that again. There's not another pawn that can kind of force this knight away, and since he does have this pawn protection right here, it's kind of an outpost, even though it's kind of high up the pitch here on d6, still a nice little outpost for black. Pawn here to f4, just starting to try to put pressure on the king side. Again, if he wants to, he can go ahead and bring his rook over here to g1 and really start to add pressure on the king side of Magnus Carlsen. Now, queen to d6, threatening this pawn right here. Queen here to d4, just centralizing the queen, also adding a protector to that pawn right here. Rook over here to d8, so kind of what we talked about, starting to add pressure on this pawn here on d5. And then a really great move by Vishy Anand. We see bishop here to e6, a nice little outpost for this bishop right here. It's going to be very difficult for Magnus Carlsen to deal too much with that. Queen over here to b6, and Magnus Carlsen decides, hey, he's completely okay to exchange off these queens on board. Potentially he doesn't like the situation on board, so just wants to exchange everything off and go in kind of to a draw game. Vishy Anand's not having it. He has the white pieces. He came for the championship. He wants to go and try to fight for the win as much as possible. But, you know, he could have taken right here. We see an exchange on board. All of a sudden, Magnus Carlsen has double pawns here on the b file, which is not where you want your doubled pawns. You could now see the king come over here to b1, knight to d6, and it could have continued from there. But as we talked about on game, we see the queen come back here to d2, still protecting this pawn on f4, so always important to make sure he's putting his pieces in position to defend all of his pieces. So rook over here to d6, opening up the door for another rook to come over here to d8 and add more pressure. Now rook over here to e1, and now we start to see potentially pressure on this backward pawns here on e7. So if we see something take right here, then all of a sudden black's going to have to worry about this pawn here on e7. We do see the knight come back here to d8, attacking this bishop. Pawn here to f5, and then we see just an exchange off board. And now white has to decide how he wants to take. One option would be to take with his rook. He could also take with his pawns. So a few options on board. Probably the best choice is what he did, and that's taking with his rook here on e6. Now Magnus Carlsen has a few options. He can just forget about it and not worry about taking this material right now. He could play queen to c7. That's an option. Maintain pressure not only on this rook on d6, but also on this backward pawn here on e7, which is now under attack. He could also just take with his rook right here. And then we see the pawn take here on e6, and then let's say queen to c5, again still holding down the pressure on here. Check, king over here to b1, and then rook swing over here to c8, putting a lot of pressure. In the game, with those kind of two options at hand, Magnus Carlsen decided to go for the queen to c7. Again, this is check, still kind of defending both of his squares. And we see king come back here to b1. Nice safe square for Vishy Anand, so it'll be curious to see how he continues with pressure. Rook over here to c8, controlling this long c file right here. Rook over here to e1, now adding more pressure on this backward pawn on e7. So now black is, I wouldn't say forced to take in exchange, but definitely much better for him. So now the rook taking here on e6 to continue to add pressure to this pawn on e7. Rook over here to d8, now adding pressure on this pawn right here. And so we see queen to e3, now adding pressure to the pawn here on e7. Rook to d7. And then the pawn pushing forward, recognizing that if this rook were to swing down here, or even this queen, then this pawn right here on e7 would be undefended by less than 2 pieces. So that would be not great. So the pawn takes here on d6. Instead of taking back right away, decides to go ahead and first just improve his position a little bit. Queen taking, or queen to d4, threatening this queen to f7. So black has 2 pieces defending this square here on d6, but now Vichy Anand's kind of forced Magnus Carlsen's hand to defend this square here on f6. So we see the rook swing over here, and now after the pawns take right here, we do see the rook take here on d6. So as we get into the end game here, both sides have 2 pawns on board. Neither side has double pawns, so both pawn structures are going to be fine. Both sides have equal material. Both sides have fairly somewhat safe kings. You can't really get your kings too involved into the game. Usually in the end game, you want to get your kings centralized. You can't really do that when your opponents have queens on board, because they can just do some scary stuff, and they can really threaten all your other pieces and pawns on the board. So you're going to see the kings stay pretty safe, and then just see if either side of the board can find some small error or advantage in the end game. So now we see pawn to a6, pawn to a3, queen to a5, pushing forward with f4. Now the queen's going to come back over here to h5, threatening this pawn over here. The queen just comes back here to d2. Both sides just kind of moving around a little bit, just threatening as much as they can. But again, there's not much both sides can do right now. The king coming back here to a2, just trying to stay as safe as possible. Rook to e7. As you can see, they're always having both their rooks and their queens kind of partnering with each other, whether they be on the same column or file. Both of them are pretty much doing the same thing throughout. So queen coming back here. Pawns to a5, so Magnus Carlsen starting to try to push on the queen side. Now the queen's going to come over here to f1, starting to threaten some of the push that may happen from black here. Pawn to a4, now the rook's going to swing down, kind of partner up with this queen right here. Queen to c2, and then the rook here. We now see the rook come back down here, attacking this pawn on h2. Also, white was kind of threatening the queen to b5 here, adding 2 attackers on the pawn here on a4, and it'd be very difficult for black to kind of swing over here and defend that. So rook to e2 kind of stops all that, and it also adds an attacker here on the pawn here on h2. So now we see a rook over here to b4, and then pawn to b5, and white can't take this. So it may look, well, okay, this is undefended, and he brought his rook over here to attack this, but he can't take. Queen here to c4, that would be very, very bad. That would be pretty much just game over. White's going to lose his rook, so don't want to do that. Instead, on the game, decides to go ahead and bring his rook over here to h1. And then we see the rook swing back here to e7. Again, both sides just can't find any errors on board. And so eventually, after the king comes to h6, then we see some repeating moves. And then eventually both sides to go ahead and shake hands and draw the first game after 48 moves. So I kind of expect it. It's the first game in a long series. Usually not going to see too many fireworks. So Vichy Anand played pretty standard d4 opening. Magnus Carlsen decided for a very sound and structural, nothing too crazy with the Grunfeld defense. He didn't try to get out any crazy lines. So kind of what I expected. Was hoping for a little more fireworks. I'm hoping that tomorrow, when Magnus Carlsen, the defending champion, comes out with white, that he plays something a little bit more aggressive. Maybe it won't be E4 like I'd hoped for, but I'm definitely hoping for something pretty good. Both sides, though, again, I think are highly motivated to win this again, since they'll be champion for 2 years. So excited for this series. Hopefully you guys enjoyed watching the recap of this game. Maybe you learned something. That'd be cool too. I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.